but we'll be talking about open source in government. And in particular, how I've been working for the last few years with the state administration of Geneva to set up an InnerSource program. And if you were listening to what Wolfgang had to say about InnerSource at the time, you were saying it's easy. It's not always easy. So I'll be talking about the parts that are slightly less easy than a Daimler. So this is going to be short. I'm just going to talk about what we were doing before, looking at politics, because we're doing InnerSource for a state administration, how we built a strategy, how we are implementing it right now, and what's stopping us from doing as much as we would want, and where we're going to be looking at for the future. So that's our program for today. And so in terms of pre-existing context, just to tell you a little bit of where we are. We've been doing open source because here at State Administration of Geneva, InnerSource starts with open source. Very often, InnerSource is used as a stepping stone in order to go to open source. But in our case, we started as open source. We've been doing open source for a long time using a whole bunch of applications, which you see mentioned here on the slide. I won't go into all the details. Our education services are also using open source, and sometimes we've tried to do open source, which wasn't really open source. For example, in 2016, where we published our e-voting code, but we put all kinds of rules in order to access it. And the open source community basically told us, no, go back to the drawing board. This is not open source if you have to sign NDAs and agreement not to publish stuff if you find vulnerabilities and so on. So it hasn't been such an easy path from the beginning, but we are trying. And I joined the team in order to get this more in place. When I arrived, we didn't have any kind of InnerSource. We had some internal tools to help people communicate about what they're doing, and we used Jabber. Yeah, we used Jabber. Sorry about that. And that's it. And that's it. Not everybody knows that there's a Jabber room for InnerSource. Not everybody knows that we're doing InnerSource. So it was time to actually set things in motion. So in order to do that, we went back to the drawing board, in particular because we are a state administration. So politics gets in the way, or actually politics supports things. So we, as I said, we started with open source. And interestingly enough, because Geneva is a republic, people say Canton of Geneva, but it's a canton and a republic. The official name is Republican Canton of Geneva, as you can see on my screen right here, where my finger is pointed. So republic means Respublica in Latin. It means the thing of the public. So the thing of the public means that if the public gives to the republic should give back. As such, we built an open source strategy that says that we publish as open source things that we develop because it's funded by the public. So that's where we started with our open source strategy. And why am I talking about open source strategy? Because as you see, the political objectives we had in addition to being a republic was to satisfy the canton leadership. They wanted to see things. They wanted to see that we're doing open source. They wanted us to show our excellence, our competence by sharing code, by being referred to by other cantons, by other administrations. They wanted us to drive inter-canton collaboration, so create projects across cantons. And some of these can be done as InnerSource, other can be done as open source, depending on, like Wolfgang said, whether the code that is being shared and developed makes sense outside of our 2 or 3 or 4 cantons working together, or whether it's only for us because it's internally and it's very specific. We want to be a more attractive recruiter. In order to do that, we communicate, but also we provide an internal environment that is attractive to developers. And open source contributions, as well as InnerSource development methodologies, which look a lot like open source, tend to be an attractive factor for developers. So that's something that we tie to InnerSource. And then we wanted to foster inter-team collaboration. We're structured in various directions, and historically, these tend to work in silos. You know, for example, we have 5 or 6 different libraries to enter dates that were developed by each team. And because they're not looking at what the rest of the group is doing. So these silos are making development extremely redundant and wasting a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of money. And so can we abolish these silos? So as you can see from these political objectives, we need to be better at doing our stuff. Some of them actually directly map into InnerSource. And so this is where we decided that when we created our open source strategy, we actually had InnerSource in our design elements as well. So how did we design it? We basically took the official IT strategy of the state administration and we built from there. And this was not necessarily easy because we still do not have an open source program office. So we don't even have an InnerSource program office, of course. We're in the process of designing that. I'll talk about it later, which will include InnerSource as its one of its areas of influence and expertise. So we decided to align our open source and InnerSource strategy to the existing axis of the existing IT strategy, right? One strategy to rule them all. One open source strategy that includes InnerSource, and it's driven InnerSource as open source from the same team. So as I said, we don't have an OSPO. We have a few dedicated people that are today hosted inside a development organization, which is not the best place to have an open source team or an InnerSource team. It should be much higher in the organization so that it influence legal, innovation, HR, and so on. But despite that, we worked with this team to create a strategy. We built it on 3 strategic axes, which are part of our IT strategy, which is to position the Geneva state as the key regional player for IT technologies, to better serve the citizens with creative solutions tailored to their needs, and to create a culture of excellence and better risk control, and of course, breaking down silos by mutualizing resources. Now, when we created that strategy, we actually did collaborative workshops, internal collaborative workshops. So very InnerSourcey, where we shared information, we shared our guidelines, we had discussions, we did brainstorming sessions, we got people involved that wanted to be involved. And once we did that, we got it approved by our management and we published the actual strategy online. You have the URL here. Geneva is a French-speaking canton, so the strategy is in English, but it's published on our GitHub. And we haven't yet people do any pull requests for adding stuff to it. We're hoping not many people do, but it is published there. We try to publish a lot of our open source related activities on our GitHub because it helps with our own visibility. So this is where it gets interesting, hopefully. How did we implement that? And as I said, unlike Wolfgang's case, it's not easy. It wasn't always easy. It's not going to be easy for the future because we have a lot of history to drive. So first of all, we don't have an OSPO. We don't have an ISPO. I'm pretty sure I mentioned it already a few times, and I will keep mentioning it. We did that series of workshops to create the elements of the strategy and prioritize which elements we needed to put in place first, because we got so many ideas and so little time and resources that we had to prioritize. We aligned that with the various elements of our general IT strategy, and we made sure that this InnerSource and open source strategy, well, covered both open source and InnerSource. Now, what was hard to do is getting the management on board. And unfortunately, this being a government organization, we have to get politicians, sorry about that, on board, including our director general. So that was a little hard because not everybody wants to talk to him. People have to follow their hierarchy. You talk to somebody who talks to somebody who talks to somebody. And at some point, you just send an email to the guy and they say, why did you contact him directly? But it worked. We got the director general to actually sign our strategy and give it their stamp of approval. Unfortunately, at this point, we're still inside the developer organization. So while we had the approval from the director general, it still required a lot of communication and education to get people to listen to what we're doing. We also created trainings, educational programs where we explain how to contribute, how to contribute open source code, publish open source code. As Wolfgang mentioned, we also have a GitHub and a GitLab. GitLab is for internal code. GitHub is for our external code. So we developed inner source mode on GitLab. And for code that then makes sense to publish as open source, we have tools that synchronize our internal GitLab repository to our external GitHub repository, and educating people on how to do that was really significant. We created licenses, we did workshops on selecting licenses, and so on. We have an actual team that supports our developers in publishing their code, whether it is published as open source or internally as inner source. And we also started engaging using this strategy as a communication tool and using our existing tools like GitHub and so on with our external partners. For example, now we're asking people who asked to develop code for us to make that code available as open source, or at least open sourceable, even if the development part of the code actually takes place in a more of an open inner source mode with code shared with them. And we've started to push for the creation of an open source program office. And as I speak today, actually, no, as of yesterday, I understand that we are going to have the approval for creating an OSPO. And of course, this being an administration, we can't call it a program office because in our organization, a program is something very specific. So we're not going to call it the OSPO, we're going to call it something else, maybe the Open Source Governance Organization or whatever. But it will have a name and it will exist. And that OSPO, or whatever it's going to be called, will have as its core responsibility to drive internal development and inner source. So that's where we are today. With all of these things in place or done. And it wasn't, as I mentioned, it wasn't that easy. In particular, administrations full of hierarchy, full of red tape, full of people who get in the way, full of people who are afraid to go beyond people who get in the way. So if somebody is blocking you from doing something, nobody wants to write to their N+1, which tends to be your N+2, because the person who get in the way is your management. So sometimes it gets a little slow. I, being an external resource, I'm a consultant, I tend to ignore some of these rules and directly contact people. And then people in my team look at me wide-eyed and say, what? You talk to who? But it works in general. And that helps a lot. So having external resources in your organization may be a way when they play candid. Oh, I was not supposed to talk to him. It may be a way to circumvent some of the red tape, some of the blocking people, if your internal team are too used to not being able to do that. And I worked in so many organizations where this is the case, that it sort of came naturally, that was the best way to go. Now, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, our strategy was approved by the Director General, but it was not really communicated, meaning the Director General didn't actually do a full communication saying, yes, we have a new strategy, follow it. Which means that it's hard, because when you go talk to somebody, in particular, because we're, as I said, inside a development organization and not part of, say, the CTO organization, or better, the COO organization, which would be ideal. Ask me if you want during the Q&A why I think COO would be better, but because we're somewhere deep down, it actually requires a bit of additional effort to get people to listen to what you have to say about the way to develop, because not all the development is done in our development organizations. We have IT teams, we have network teams, we have communications teams, we have database and product teams, and all these people do their own development as well. And they don't necessarily report or even listen to what the official development organization that develops client solutions, clients being citizen solutions. So it's a mess. And communication, having proper communication from the Director General would be a significant plus. It's not there. Also, it was interesting because when we started talking about InnerSource, a lot of people just came and said, "Oh yeah, I know, it's really great. We're going to do InnerSource, and why not actually take all of the code that is on our GitLab and set a flag on every piece of software that is InnerSource." And it's like, wait, if the code is internal, if it's accessible by anybody internally, whether it's labeled InnerSource or not, people can look at it, read it, learn from it, clone it, use it, possibly contribute to it, or at least do a merge request on GitLab, and it becomes de facto InnerSource. It doesn't really need to be labeled as InnerSource. And that got me some really blank stares, like, why not? And you know, I understand what they want, is that if you label code as InnerSource, it means it's ready for consumption. But it's the same thing as with open source, right? You're not going to publish your code once it's ready for consumption. You're publishing as soon as you can. Sometimes it's buggy code. Sometimes there's something that says it's being developed right now. Don't worry. Don't complain too much. If you find a bug, fix it. If you wait for the code to be fully ready for consumption, chances are you're never going to publish it. So the idea of having something that says this is InnerSource code took some time to dispel, and people started saying, okay, yeah, we understand everything is InnerSource. We have some strange rules on our GitLab. For example, all of the code is open. Anybody can contribute, actually. More importantly, anybody can modify the code. We didn't configure the code so that people have to actually do merge requests. You can just edit a file, which the rationale being that we're all one team and everybody should be able to edit the code. As a result, it's a mess. It's not at all using the typical methodologies that we have in open source, where you have contributors, where you have people who do approvals of contributions and mergings and things like that. So it's a bit of a mess. We have these strange rules. But on the other hand, we do have some really cool tools. So inside our GitLab, we have all of our CI/CD tools and code quality testing and so on. So that's really nice to have GitLab for that. But we also have very nice tools that let us publish direct your code to GitHub using synchronization. And that's cool because those synchronization tools let us actually accept pull requests and issues on the external GitHub, and then we can fix them internally on the GitLab, and then that gets put back externally. Of course, it would be much better if anything that needs to be open source was developed directly on GitHub, but you know, it takes time to change the mindset. So for now, people develop internally on GitLab, whether it's InnerSource or open source, and by default, anything that's developed on GitLab is considered InnerSource. But hopefully we'll change at some point. Normally, we have an open source first strategy, which includes not only looking for new solutions, should first look at open source options, and if we don't find open source options, then we look for non-open source. But it also applies to development. If we're going to develop software or make software developed, then it should be made open source if by default, unless security, IP, whatever reasons prevent it. And that's interesting because that was part of our strategy developed 3-4 years ago. And it actually appeared in the Swiss federal law 2 years ago. There is a law that's called the LMETA in French, and it has a different name in German, but I never remember it. And that law, that federal law actually states that any state organization, federal organization that developed code or has code developed must make it open source unless. And so we apply that. We were there before the federal law, and we're doing this as open source, and then moving on progressively also as inner source for stuff that doesn't need to be made public, or you should not. For example, if we're developing tax software, some rules for defining default taxation are not public. Some rules for fraud detection wouldn't be public, and so on. Another roadblock is we have a new director general. And so it was hard to get the original director general to approve it, and they still didn't communicate about it. The new director general was very hesitant about open source. They were not like opposed to open source, but they're really like looking at it as a kind of a necessary evil. If you want, yeah, these guys are doing it. It really needs to be done, but they're not happy about the fact that it's something that was decided by their predecessor. Which is always the case, right? When you have somebody new in a decisional role, they tend to look at what was done before as, well, not my stuff, so not necessarily good. Fortunately, we actually had some really bad press recently that said, oh, wait, Geneva is all Microsoft and they're a state administration. They shouldn't be doing Microsoft. And so now the new director general is finally understanding the value of open source, in particular as a communication tool. So this is where we are going to actually have the funding for creating an open source program office, for participating in funding open source projects, and being a lot more visible around our open source activities, which means also having this OSPO means we're going to have a stronger tool for driving InnerSource. So it's interesting here, a little bit of a sidetrack here, but bad press is still good press in the sense that sometimes you get things to move. And in particular, our director general, which I'm happy they decided to move. So I have one more slide, where we're going now. So the new director general, now that they understand the interest of open source, we're going to have him actually support the open source strategy, promote the open source strategy, and communicate about it, so that once we have formalized the creation of an open source InnerSource program office or government governing office or whatever, it will have a lot of strengths. We still don't know where it's going to be hosted. Hopefully not inside the development organization, but that's going to be a political issue. We have support from the magistrate that is above our director general, so inside the Geneva government, so that's really good. Next step after creating the OSPO is creating a governance model and implementing it better than what we do today, which is very ad hoc. And since we're still trying to put in place the program office, defining a governance model is a little tricky because we don't have official stakeholders. We only have informal ones. Some of them change and decide not to be law anymore, whatever. We're going to push for leveraging InnerSource more, in particular using tools like internal communications, where we have an internal mailing list that talks about our open source and InnerSource activities. And every time somebody publishes something new as InnerSource or open source, but as InnerSource, we have them write an article and talk about what they're doing, because by doing that, we are hoping that people will see that, and it will motivate them to actually do the same thing. Publish code, make it properly documented, have open APIs, generic implementation, so that other teams can use the code. And then in turn, they could be visible as a success story. We're also looking at, we have screens on the walls that display dynamic content. So gamifying by having posts about who's the biggest contributor to our InnerSource repositories internally, or things like that. And I forgot to mention it, and it is really important. We are implementing a developer portal so that people can actually go and search for existing code rather than ask on our Jabber InnerSource channel, does anybody know of a library that does this or that? Because this is not a really efficient way of looking for code. Actually, you could ask that to an AI that runs on the portal and scans all of the repositories, and you probably get a better answer than asking on a Jabber channel. So that's where we're going now. So you see, we have quite a few things to do. Despite the fact that we've been doing this for 3 years, we're still very, very much in the infancy of the InnerSource program, because administrations go really slowly. And I will finish this slide and talking about administrations going slowly by quoting Albert Einstein, who, when he retired, was asked by a journalist, so where do you want to go spend the end of your life once you retire? And they said, I want to go to Geneva because everything takes 10 to 20 more years to happen over there. And this is where we are, in Geneva. They're not going to take 10 to 20 years, but it's going to take some time.